Recently, a lot more focus has been placed on manhwa and manhua in the anime and manga communities, which is great! It's always good to experience other cultures, and media is one way to do that if you can't go physically. But because it's become so much more popular to discuss this media, odd debates and confusion are also on the rise. Specifically, the difference between manga, manhwa, and manhua, and why you should even bother to make the distinction. So sit back and let us do the hard work of researching, collating, and presenting all this information for you.
At the very basic level, the difference is this. Manga is Japanese comics, manhwa Korean comics, and manhwa Chinese comics, and shrimps is bugs. But if it was that simple, people wouldn't be arguing over it. So let's look into the background of each of these to get a better understanding. By looking into the historical, the contemporary, and cross-cultural reception, maybe we can work out this whole debate over if using these terms is pretentious or useful, starting with the one people are least likely to know about and working backwards towards the one most people should have heard of. But I'm sure we can still dig up a few interesting facts for the more scholarly among you.
So just a little disclaimer before we start, we've looked up pronunciation guides for a lot of the terms we're using in this video, but despite this, we cannot guarantee that we will get all of them right or even be entirely consistent. So before you comment that we pronounced a word wrong, please keep in mind that we're trying, and both of us have British accents, so you'll hear English words pronounced differently too. Languages and accents just be that way. Also, as you can see in the title, this video will contain a few recommendations, but please try not to spoil anything in your comments. Thanks, and on to the video.
Manhwa was a term popularized in the 1700s, but the history of it goes back as far as Chinese history does. Before there was paper in China, this was in the form of stone carving and paintings on pottery. Using images to depict things is just a part of being human, but the invention of lithographs and the printing press helped those images be spread further than ever before. From the 1870s, newspapers started having political comics that were a reflection of the news through a more personal and creative lens. Eye-grabbing compared to blocks of text, and often easy to understand, especially for those unable to read, they were quickly popularized due to this sudden accessibility. In the 1920s, smaller, simpler, and standalone comics called Lan Yuan Hu became widespread. The format would have several pages with a double spread image which was bound together. These were often a retelling of mythology or folklore, and as with American comics, aimed for a younger audience. In 1928, Shanghai Manhwa was established in, well, Shanghai, and brought together members of the Shanghai Sketch Society to publish more extensive magazines, with multiple authors' works. This was the first successful memoir in China. Although only 8 pages long, it was produced weekly, and focused on depicting life in the city, but also commented on socio-political issues and contained photography alongside its provocative cartoons. The art style at this point was semi-realistic and used muted colours, with the various artists having their own style. It continued over the next 2 years, but business disputes caused the magazine to disband, with some members going on to create a new memoir called Modern Sketch, while others later re-established Shanghai Manhwa in 1936 and even created an exhibition to show off Chinese cartoonists and an association for them to collaborate and promote memoir as a national art form. Sadly, it was short-lived as a celebration of art, as the Japanese invasion during the Second World War led to Shanghai being captured and heavily bombed, causing them to shift solely to propaganda. Other memoir publications of this time also promoted propaganda about the war and encouraged people to enlist in the army. However, by 1941, all memoir ceased production and stayed out of business until Japan's surrender in 1945. The post-war world they returned to had changed wildly, with Taiwanese memoir and Japanese manga undercutting the newly developing domestic market. This changing landscape changed even further with the introduction of TV in China, and the popularity of martial arts movie stars like Bruce Lee, which led to violent kung fu memoir becoming widespread. Around this time, the Hong Kong memoir market became its own entirely separate industry and developed its own style and influences, including displaying text vertically and reading right to left. China began strictly controlling all aspects of their media during the 60s and 70s with the Cultural Revolution, which sought to overthrow capitalist ideas that had spread in China. The revolution led to wide-scale violence, but also attempted to spread communism through soft power, emphasizing film and art that painted communism and communist China in a positive light. Some of this censorship continued into the early 2000s, which led to a lot of artists choosing to self-publish online, where they could post political and less controlled content. The rise of social media also helped this, and sites like Weibo and Douban allowed memoir artists to reach bigger audiences, and it still remains the primary way that manhwa is distributed. Of the three, it is the smallest industry, although it's still growing and developing into a mainstream form of media. The development of manhwa into animation and officially published series is also a lot less likely than the other two because of this smaller scale. However, Tencent, a multimedia publisher, has stated they aim to bring manhwa to the global market, but considering that was a statement from 2017, it may take some time. But there are some manhwa that have become popular enough to reach the West, such as Heaven's Official Blessing, Mao Dao Zushi, and The King's Avatar. The Chinese equivalent to anime, donghua, is also increasing in global popularity, with the adaptations of all these examples making their way onto YouTube, Netflix, and Crunchyroll. We went into a big UK chain bookshop and found their manga section, which very conveniently had a big table of recommendations. I thought it'd be fun to count how many were manhwa, manhwa, and manga. For manhwa, it was just one. And so not to spoil the surprise, you'll get the manhwa and manga numbers in their respective sections, and then we'll try and do some fun analysis. Normally this is the point where we would recommend some manhwa for you to read, but I've actually never really read any Chinese manhwa. I once read the Taiwanese manhwa Half Prince, but I have no idea if I would really recommend it, although it is amusing it's an early VR MMO isekai with gender bending.
This is where I come in. I read many a manhwa when I was like 17 and up at 4 in the morning. I have two to recommend. First is SQ Begin With Your Name, or Tamen Degushi. It's a slice of life story, mainly focusing on the relationship and subsequent romance between Sung Jin and Shi Tong? Pronunciation is hard. It's very cute, and the art is just so relaxing. The manga began its life on Weibo and Twitter, and as a result, each chapter is short and non-linear, so the plot jumps around, but the characters are lovely, and it's actually really funny, so check it out if you're into that. My second recommendation is for those more into action. I present you Dolu Dalu, or Soulland, a behemoth of a story with 339 plus chapters that I can find, and not one, not two, but 3 sequels, all ongoing as far as I can tell. I remember finding Dulu Dalu 2, starting it, and realizing that it was set 10,000 years after the ending of the first. And once you're done with that, there's games and an anime with like 200 plus episodes, so if you get into the world, you won't run out of adaptations for a while.
The history of manhwa starts in the early 1900s, the youngest of our three, and was born during the Japanese occupation of Korea, which officially began in 1910. As part of the Japanese Empire, their culture and language was forced onto the pre-existing Korean culture. This included the destruction of cultural artifacts, forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese surnames, and making speaking Korean illegal. During this time, manhwa mostly existed as political and social newspaper cartoons. But even within a few years, most newspapers were shut down by the Japanese Empire and replaced with ones more in line with the Japanese government. However, independent newspapers persisted, such as the Chosun Ilbo, which still runs today as Korea's oldest newspaper. Although it had a 5-year hiatus, as in 1940 the Japanese government forcefully closed this rebellious paper, which had been recording daily life under the imperial rule through articles and, of course, manhwa. While political art was being censored and stifled, a lot of manhwa shifted to gags and comics for children in the newspapers that were allowed to run. But political manhwa started to come back once Korea gained some independence from Japan, and a magazine that was exclusively for manhwa called Manhwa Hainjin was published by a popular artist of the time, Kim Young-hwang. Sure. But it failed after one issue because he decided to put an erotic image on the front cover. Okay, so a bit of a tangent. This video is supposed to be informative with a little cultural and historical context. How China, Japan, and Korea have been entwined and separated, and how that's influenced the art of these 3 countries. But while researching this, I was struck with a deep sadness for how little of this history seems readily available. I can't find that smutty front cover, and half the leads I could find led to paywalled or account-locked information kept only for the access of specific universities. Maybe it's out there somewhere. Or maybe it was destroyed so completely by those that hated it. But the fact that this cover that caused so much controversy and is referenced by so many books and articles is just seemingly nowhere really saddens me. I don't have as good a grasp on Korean as I do Japanese, so my attempts to try and find it through searches in Korean were not great. I hope it's out there, but the inaccessibility of information, even though the internet is so wide and so full, always astounds me. Manhwa is much more popular in the Anglosphere than manhwa, but even so, it's only this small slice of translated history that's available to us. In our souls, we are hoarders, archivists. We want to keep all these little pieces alive in the stream of humanity's consciousness, and part of that is making information accessible where possible. As I said in the intro, this video is supposed to be a good start for those newly interested in the subject. We're going to link interesting resources we found in a Google Doc in the description, so anyone interested can read further and maybe even find what we couldn't. Any one video should always be a drop that feeds your overall understanding of a subject, not your sole pool of information on it. The more sources of information, the more likely we are to keep these things alive, no matter how small or niche. But anyway, back to Manhwa. Manhwa once again became a political force as a way to try to bring positivity to the country during the Korean War, and led to a boost in popularity over the next decades. With popularity came expansion and diversification, with new styles and genres popping up to satisfy this new audience, like Sunjong and Myeongyang, which are romance and gag comics respectively. An interesting part of Korean culture is the idea of manhwa bang and PC bang, which are cafe-style shops that let you rent their manhwa and PCs respectively. And while we did have internet cafes in the UK, they very much fell out of fashion, compared to in South Korea where some 10,000 still exist. Fitting since they supposedly started there. Manga cafes, however, were established in the late 70s by Japan. The idea was quickly picked up in Korea. These spaces charged by the hour, but at the current equivalent of 1,000 won, it was incredibly accessible to the youth, who might not have been able to afford a whole PC and internet, or every volume of manhwa they wanted to read, but they could afford an hour or two a week for a manhwa bang. This only further boosted the popularity of manhwa, but unfortunately this was seen as a threat to the South Korean government, who in the 1970s targeted foreign influences such as American music, protest songs, and Japanese manga. They also attempted to establish their own manhwa distribution companies to monopolize the media being produced in Korea to have more control over what got published. At this time, manhwa once again became a source for social control, with Hapdong Publishing offering cheaper manhwa and putting their competitors out of business, letting them buy up or replace them entirely. Once they had control, they underpaid their artists and tried to expand to every other aspect of manhwa. Propaganda isn't always war is good. Sometimes it's more subtle, like pushing a harsh dichotomy of what is good and evil, or overemphasizing a country's economic prowess and value. In South Korea's case, the good guys were them, and the evil guys were North Korea. There was also a push for sci-fi to keep the country's industrial expansion at the front of people's minds. In the late 1990s, the ban on foreign media was lifted, and cross-cultural exchanges between manhwa and manga were allowed to flourish once again. Right up until the 1997 economic collapse, which made publishing unviable and forced the manhwa industry onto the internet. While born of desperation, this was ultimately what led to the immense popularity manhwa has developed in recent years. Or more accurately, that webtoon has developed. The history of the word webtoon actually started 4 years before the webtoon company became the global manhwa powerhouse it is today. It's simply a portmanteau of web and cartoon. As with Chinese manhwa, the shift to online publication meant it was easier for artists to circumvent the censorship of the times, and allowed an accessibility that traditional publishing didn't offer. A lot of webtoon sites offered the content for free, or had a model of paying for early access. However, nowadays it's more common for this later model, or for the first episode to be free and all subsequent to have to be paid for with a coin-based currency. Webtoon, the company, was established by Naver in 2004. Naver was initially a search engine, but rapidly expanded into other web-based services, and now occupies a similar niche as Google does in the West. In fact, Naver's popularity is so big that Google was barely present in the country at all up until 2022. Naver's position as a search engine allowed it to push Webtoon above its competitors in the webcomic market, and led to them being the top platform for webcomics. In 2014, they expanded into the international market with Line Webtoon, an online and mobile app-based service. They selected 42 webtoons to bring over to the English market. Alongside this, they picked one American comic artist to be platformed, who no article bothered to name. But I am 99% sure it was Shen's Blue Chair comic, which you can see briefly in the lineup of their launch trailer for the English version of Webtoon. Many non-Korean webcomic artists started posting on the platform as part of this global push, and they also offered a self-publishing section called Canvas. Anyone can publish webcomics to this part of the platform, but Webtoon didn't support them the same way as their Webtoon originals. Naver has had a lot of controversies over the years, for the way they paid their artists and their underhanded business tactics. They function pretty much how you'd expect any tech conglomerate to act. with frequent collaborations with big names like Crunchyroll, Stan Lee, and DC Comics, borrowing these other companies' goodwill to boost their own image. Except Crunchyroll, which has no goodwill after they adapted 3 of the most popular webtoons into mediocre anime, and are also just an all-round shitty company, as many people other than us have spoken about extensively. They have unequivocally been the driving force behind manhwa's popularity in the West though, especially by providing official English translations, as well as allowing fan translations to be hosted on their app. Compared to Chinese manhwa, Korean manhwa have been incredibly successful in the West, with a lot of popular K-dramas like True Beauty and What's Wrong with Secretary Kim being based on webtoons. The relationship is a two-way street, with popular Korean shows getting webtoon adaptations, such as with Extraordinary Attorney Woo and On Your Wedding Day. And Webtoon isn't the only company getting in on this, with Lazy Comics and Kakao also having pretty big platforms. Manhwa are also published under non-Korean labels like Tokyo Pop and Yen Press, but are often under the label of manga. We'll get into more of why this distinction matters in a later section, but just keep in mind all the history of divergence and the way manhwa tend to look. So it is somewhat a positive and negative that Webtoon has so much influence, with TV shows like Sweet Home getting a chance to be made and really expand from the original webcomic, even if season 2 sucks. They also do allow smaller creators visibility that they just might not get on social media sites. But in my own personal experience, I did stop using Webtoon a year or 2 ago, once they introduced even more paywalling, including a system called Day Pass, where you could unlock a certain number of chapters a day for free, or pay money. This was frustrating, as I wanted to catch up on a webcomic called Dice, and discovered it had ended some 100 chapters from where I'd read up to. If I wanted to finish it, I would have to wait 50 days of reading 2 chapters a day, or pay $30 in coins. And those unlocked chapters are only available to you for 2 weeks. It's actually mind-boggling to me how anti-consumer their practices have become. I went back to gather some footage of this and discovered it's somehow even worse, with free passes being given out in return for watching ads, which is scummy, but the fact there's a massive ad for some trashy mobile game on each webtoon just feels insulting to the artists and writers making these manhwa. Webtoon clearly sees these works as just a product for making money, and not a form of artistic expression being shared with human beings. And since we are also human beings who want to communicate with other human beings, I set out to get the opinions of an artist I know who posts on Webtoon Canvas. This is what she had to say. As a whole, I think Webtoon and apps related to it have been a positive addition to the webcomic space for less experienced artists. It offers an easy to understand platform that is also completely free to use, and it's a great way for artists to begin their journey into the world of webcomics. I do think that their promotion features could use some work, as it's been pretty evident that favorites are played when curating lists of comics that are put on the front page. I also think that new comic artists and authors should be aware that it's a very competitive app, and success in general is not a guarantee, let alone a financial success. I personally know many incredible artists who create fantastically drawn and written comics who nevertheless haven't reached the success that they very much, in my opinion, deserve. I also think that their content moderation requires a lot more consistency. 18+ comics regularly being promoted on a 13+ app isn't a great look. If you want to find her on Webtoon, she currently has 2 comics in the works, Clockwork and Bloodstone. Both of these are linked below. And thank you very much again for taking your time to give us this information and perspective. So that's where Webtoon and manhwa stand today. Also, the number of manhwa on that bookshop table was 4.
Now onto our recommendation. Solo Farming in the Tower is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a story about a Korean man who gets transported into this magical tower alone and becomes a tower farmer. The original web novel is written by Lim Hyung, and the webcomic is illustrated by Lee Hae-kyung. Now, we both love this manhwa for multiple reasons, and totally not just because all the creatures are super adorable. Take, for example, Theo, the cheeky cat merchant. Look at his little face. Or any of these adorable faces. Go read Solo Farming in the Tower.
Now, we did say at the beginning that we would try to make this interesting, even if you thought you knew a lot about manga, so let's see how well we can do. And if you really think you know everything, just go to this timestamp here to hear our manga recommendations. Once again, we begin our tale in the 1700s, where the term manga first came to be used. At this time, manga were made using woodblock printing, which used carved wooden blocks to layer colors and create mass-producible artworks. The complexity of the Japanese language potentially influenced these image-heavy art forms, as mass-producing text was much harder than creating a few woodblocks for each image and hand-carving the text into them. This is actually similar to the history of printing for English, which even though it had far less characters, newspapers would still drop letters from their alphabets and conjoin or change spellings of common words. This is part of where we see a divergence in British and American English, as the American newspapers would drop the U or other supposedly superfluous letters in certain words, like program and catalog. Function influences form, and form influences function. So one of the most influential and well-known manga artists of this era was Santo Kyoden, who was an illustrator and tobacco shop owner who loved to combine these two careers through self-advertising his shop in other people's works. His work was referred to as manga because it was simpler and more impromptu, sketching the people he watched from the window of his shop. In this regard, it was more being used like the word sketch, and was descriptive of his style as opposed to an outright label he himself attached to his work. We have to skip a few decades forward to 1814 to see a piece self-described as manga. Hokusai manga by Katsushika Hokusai consisted of 15 volumes of thousands of sketches, and were published across the end of the artist's life and into the decades after. It wouldn't be amiss to call Hokusai the most prolific artist in Japan's history, because I can guarantee every person watching this video has seen his work or some derivative of it. The 36 views of Mount Fuji were a series of landscape prints showing the view of Mount Fuji from 36 locations, which makes the Great Wave being his most famous piece pretty ironic considering how small it is in the composition. The mountain almost blends in as a crest of the Great Wave itself despite its central placement. As beautiful as this piece is, it's functionally a tourist pamphlet, designed to draw people to the area. But then again, a lot of great art is actually advertising, and that only diminishes its aesthetic appeal a little bit. But these still aren't manga as we know them. To get to that, we actually only have to go a little further forward, to Kitazawa Rakuten, who in the late 1800s sought to work for and emulate Western comic artists. Initially trained in Nihonga and Yoga, which means Japanese painting and Western style painting respectively, he moved to working under Frank A. Nakavell, an Australian cartoonist who moved to Tokyo and later America. Inspired by his work with Nakavell, Kitazawa produced comic strips for GG Manga that heavily emulated American Sunday morning newspaper cartoons. He was further inspired to start his own version of the magazine Nakavell worked for in America, Puck, which he called Tokyo Puck, back when IP laws were non-existent. Like Puck, Tokyo Puck focused on satirical cartoons criticizing the government in glorious multicolor, a move that got the publication adjacently accused of high treason, and several issues banned from print in under 5 years of its establishment. Good job, guys. Despite this, Tokyo Puck was so popular it was distributed to China, Korea, and Taiwan, as well as being translated into English and Chinese, and inspired its own copycat with Osaka Puck, which lasted over twice as long as Tokyo Puck, 43 versus 18 years. By focusing on coming across as wholesome manga, and following government guidelines closely. It even changed its name to Nippon Manga after a ban on using English words by the war-era government. As with Manhwa and Manhua, manga was often targeted as a tool for propaganda, or as a negative influence on the youth that required strict control. Manga artists were even in support for some of this shift to propaganda, as it helped legitimize the art form as worthwhile and powerful. Other artists who were against the wars led a Nansatsu movement, which used the English word nonsense to create a movement that focused on anti-consumerist and anti-establishment works, similar to Dadaism. This was a rejection of what the government and general society stood for, and both movements attempted to find meaning in the mundane or irrational to cope with the trauma of war. The two movements even crossed paths in The Stranger's Place, a 1966 episode of the tokusatsu series Ultraman, which had a character inspired by Dadaism called Dada. The character designer for Dada was Toru Narita, who was born in the aftermath of World War I and whose career took place in the shadow of World War II. He worked on the original Godzilla film and Toei shows like Mighty Jack. While Dadaism sought to find meaning after World War I, Toei and Godzilla sought to find meaning after World War II. Tokusatsu is an abbreviation of the phrase Tokushu Satsue Gaijutsu, which means special effects technology, and is just the Japanese equivalent of SFX, which is to say, practical special effects. Tokusatsu became popular in the 1950s with Godzilla, a film so entwined in the post-atomic age that it can barely be discussed without mentioning its allegorical nature. At the same time, we see an equal criticism by Osamu Tezuka with Astro Boy. Tezuka also revolutionized manga as an art form, with his Disney-inspired cutesy characters, dynamic action and paneling, which he used to convey movement and emulate camera motion. And while Tezuka was establishing shonen as a category, Machiko Hasegawa was establishing shoujo with her manga, Sazae-san, which focused on the daily lives of women and the social issues that affected them. This was portrayed in a light-hearted and comical manner, which made it easy to read and is remembered nostalgically. It was actually also one of the first big manga to use the 4-koma style, with short, self-contained stories told across one page with 4 panels. A style that lives on in Japan with manga like Azumanga Daioh or K-On!, and in the West with any and all Instagram comic artists. This is also a place where form is influenced by format and vice versa. The original 4-koma were inspired by American newspaper comic strips, which had to fit in a small space to keep valuable paper real estate free for adverts and articles. This is the same for Japanese publications, where an artist might only get one page to convey themselves in. The specifically 4-panel approach fits ideally with traditional storytelling practices, with a setup of equilibrium, breaking that equilibrium, resolution, and then return to equilibrium. Or in comedy terms, setup, detail, punchline. Or setup, detail, punchline, subversion. But anyway, the 1960s and 70s saw a divergence in genre and demographic, as with Korea and the popularization of manhwa. Josei and seinen were established as counterparts to shoujo and shonen, and manga-specific genres like gekiga, which were dramatic and serious manga aimed at adults. Shonen ai, which was erotica aimed at women that depicted gay male romances or homoeroticism, and mecha, which is about big robots. However, this era also saw a rise in censorship and obscenity laws, which aimed to target manga for being too violent and sexual, a theme which has been present across all of the 3 we've looked at in this video. Of course, this wasn't contained only within Northeast Asia, with the video nasties of the UK and the satanic panic of the USA being around this time too. There was just something in the water at the time. The 1980s saw a rise in Japanese companies trying to push into Western markets by connecting manga artists directly to American fans, specifically by sending them to San Diego Comic-Con, a very well calculated move that put manga directly in the hands of the equivalent American market. This is also the era where we start to see what we would know as modern manga start to appear. Harem anime like Rumiko Takahashi's Ranma 1/2, battle shonen like Hiroko Araki's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and magical girl manga like Creamy Mummy. This cross-continent cultural exchange continued into the 1990s, and manga and anime became a core part of nerd culture. In the UK, we had the aptly named one-off show Manga. Airing on the BBC, it highlighted the content by publisher Manga Entertainment, who distributed anime to the UK. With a confusing and contradictory name, which would lead a young me getting into an argument with my school's librarian over the difference between manga and anime some 17 years later in 2011, an argument in which he was entirely wrong. The BBC special highlighted anime like Akira, Marine Boy, and Porco Rosso, as well as featuring interviews with animators and directors, and provided cultural context to what anime is. Growing up in the 2000s and 2010s, I was exposed to anime and manga by both sides of my family. I watched Akira at the recommendation of my mum, and Ghost in the Shell with my dad. I also watched Japanese films like Fish Story that ran at 2 AM on Film 4 as part of their Japan Week or International Hour. I remember there being Chinese and Taiwanese films on as well, but I was less interested in them, because I was raised by weebs. I don't really remember much in the way of Korean media, at least not that I was aware of. So my question to you, dear viewer, is this: what are your earliest memories of experiencing Chinese, Korean, and Japanese media? Web manga do also exist, but came about a lot later than web manhwa and manhua, with platforms like Pixiv becoming established in 2007, and often sticking to the traditional page format of published manga, which are harder to read on phones, but stand out with their black and white colouring and more detailed art styles. In more recent years, web manga has actually allowed for traditional publishers to increase their lineups, outside of their magazines, which saves on precious advertising and page real estate, best saved for established and high-earning manga, and sites like Square Enix's Gangan have produced a lot of great manga that has been distributed traditionally and ended up with anime. So that brings us up to the current day for manga, manhwa, and manhwa, and we can now reveal the final number on the bookshop table was 4 manhwa, 1 manhwa, and 29 manga. Oh, well, That's a lot more skewed than I expected, especially since on the shelves there were numerous other Manhwa and Manhwa, and even the light novels for some series. But we'll get into that later. This was the most difficult to think of recommendations for, because between us we may have genuinely read over 1,000 manga. Not that we keep count. Do I recommend something well known but underrated for the people who may be new to manga? Or do I go more niche for those of you in the know? Let's do both. So let's do the underrated, well-known work first. Parasite. This manga came out in the late 1980s to early 1990s, but it's robust and timeless enough that you could have told me it came out last year and I'd have believed you. The anime was immensely popular, and the manga is too, but I definitely think it's often overshadowed by its anime adaptation. Check it out, it's really good. And for the niche one, I definitely have to go with Rengoku no Toshi, or The City of Imprisoned Love. A sci-fi thriller mess of a manga that is sort of like High-Rise Invasion if it was set on the ground floor and had slightly less panty shots.
Are you sure about that?
It's a hard one to recommend because saying anything about it would spoil some really cool reveals, but you should totally check it out if you can find it.
I want to recommend Kyo in Kyoto, an adorable story about a young caterer in Kyoto's geisha district. I'm tempted to write a whole video just about this manga at some point, so I won't go into too much detail, but if you enjoy slow burn, character driven slice of life stories with delicious looking food, then check it out.
Why does this matter? Manga, Manhwa, and Manhwa may seem similar, but as you've now learnt, they each have their own unique cultural and historical context, and said context directly affects the stories that end up being told. Understanding this context is also important, as certain elements of manga, Manhwa, and Manhwa are often misunderstood. A common complaint is that a lot of manga is set in secondary school, and besides the fact that a lot of these are shoujo and shonen aimed at teenagers, this is because secondary school is viewed as having the same freedoms as university is in the UK. This doesn't mean that this is the only place you'll see freedom depicted. There are anime like Wotakoi that emphasize the pleasure of the life of working adults, and manga that focus on university like Honey and Clover. We've mentioned in other videos that these settings are often not very impactful to a story and function as a visual shorthand for the audience. A school reflects the most typical experience of a teenager, but it's coloured by the perspective of the creators. For them, school was the last time they didn't have to worry about a lot of things like taxes and buying groceries. It's included with the implication that it was the best time of their life. Knowing this context is valuable when analysing media in a metatextual way, but also for your own emotional response to a piece of media. This idea of freedom is pretty prevalent in American media too, and so if everything you watch tells you the ages of 14 to 18 are the best, you might feel a little reluctant to live the other 70% of your life. I think that's why I've been finding shows like Mr. Villain's Day Off reassuring. It celebrates the freedom of being an adult and the small things in life, like getting to go shopping. It is fantastical, and it definitely ignores the more depressing parts of adulthood, but it does make me feel better about being a working adult, more so than, say, My Hero Academia. And I didn't even have a 30-year-old arch nemesis I had to fight after school. Another piece of cultural context is that a lot of the plots in Manhwa often resolve around medical debt, which for British readers is not so relatable. Obviously I have some level of cognition, so I can get the gist of why this might be an issue and can still relate and empathise with the situation. It just requires a little more awareness sometimes. Chinese Manhwa will regularly use cultivation as a core mechanic, which is inspired by mythology and martial arts practices to develop your internal power. The ideas of ki may turn up unexplained in these stories, much the same way fantasy often doesn't explain what an elf is every time. The author expects a certain level of knowledge from the reader. This is where you get ideas like beginner anime, although it's not like people really understand what those should be. I would love to make a whole video on it, because anyone who recommends Konosuba as a first anime, let alone a first isekai, needs to be shaken by the shoulders until they see sense. Korean manhwa and some manga do also use cultivation, but it's very much inspired by the same Chinese mythology. But again, knowing if it's manhwa or manga or manhwa will still help you be aware of the differences, such as how Sun Wukong and Son Goku are both different cultural expressions of the Monkey King, or how a gyoza party and Korean barbecue fulfill the same social niche of a group cooking event, but have different hierarchies, settings, and expectations. Even the actual layout and style will vary. Manhwa tends to have longer vertical scrolling panels due to the heavy optimization for mobile devices, and will often be in full color because they were made without needing to worry about the cost of printing using multiple ink colors. Chinese manhwa tend to have shorter but more frequent chapters, and are also often in full color because they too evolved to be more online. But they also have quick, small turnarounds, just to keep your series on the front page. Coincidentally, this is actually part of why 50 Shades of Grey got so popular. Manga are often in black and white, even if they're only being posted online, and follow publishing ideals, but independent artists still sometimes break these rules or try to emulate manhwa. So knowing these terms is actually really useful for the same reason knowing and understanding specific genres is. It's a way to set your expectations. We would also love to do a video on manga/anime specific genres sometime, so comment any examples you can think of. We're thinking along the lines of mecha or isekai. Personally, if I'm reading on my phone, I'm more likely to find some manhwa to read because I have bad eyes and a small phone screen, so that mobile optimization is a godsend. But if I'm reading a physical copy, I prefer manga because it's already formatted in a nice way for the printed page. We own the solo leveling manhwa in print, and while a lot of work has been done to move the panels around or adjust things, certain pages lack the impact gained from scrolling through his hordes of undead and really just being part of the flow of action. This isn't an issue with print media though. I've been jump scared by page turns in Junji Ito manga. It just requires a different expectation of composition and where the reader's eyes will go to next. Format can even go a little further and inform the types of story told. Like how if I want something short with emotional punch, I tend to look for manga one-shots. But if I want to get my teeth into a cool tower climbing scenario, I might be more drawn to manhwa. Both exist in both formats, but are just more common in one than the other. And then there's even broader things, like how most of any of the three will be set in their native country. So knowing if a comic is from China, Korea, or Japan can explain why one character might be crying over a coffee costing 1,000 of a currency, while another is jumping for joy at the good deal. Why these characters are talking about military service is inevitable, or even more meta-y, why that Korean manhwa went on a 2-year hiatus. On our last video, we had an interesting comment from someone who said they use English terms for anime, which was not only an amazing coincidence because I was writing the script at the time, but baffling. There's so much implication and nuance to genres. If you tell me you're watching a soap opera, and I look over and you're watching Daily Lives of High School Boys, I'm gonna be perplexed. English has a tendency to use loanwords to distinguish a variation from somewhere else, such as the classic naan bread. While naan just means bread in Urdu, in English it means this one specific type of bread from India, which is in itself the adaptation of a Persian bread, and in Hindi, the word naan specifically means this Persian-inspired bread. The word for bread in Hindi is roti, which in some areas of the UK refers to an entirely different type of unleavened Indian bread. Another example, if I recommend you an isekai and turn on Prince Caspian, I'm violating linguistic boundaries, specifically the accuracy of language. Shout out to that one Tom Scott video. These are called Grace's maxims, and using language like isekai and naan bread specifically fulfills the maxim of manner by avoiding ambiguity. Not that anything is that easy or simple. Splitting hairs like this can be confusing and overloading for a new fan of something, but may lead a more experienced person to assume you yourself are a newbie because you called isekai portal fantasy. But in general, basic information like where a comic was made is pretty essential information you should be thinking about early on in your forays with foreign media. One time I read a manhwa that was set in London, a city I've not only visited repeatedly, but also lived in for a few years. And knowing this was made by someone Korean with a lighter or almost non-existent understanding of the place made me feel about 30% less full of rage whenever I saw a generic 3D asset street with a red phone booth slapped in somewhere. Of course these lines get blurred, and there are Japanese artists who make manhwa and Chinese artists making manga, because they're emulating the style and moved countries and got published by a manga publisher instead. There are also Western artists making manga who follow the general principles of what makes a manga. But there's no set rules for manga that wouldn't exclude some of the most popular in the medium. Set in Japan eliminates Banana Fish. In black and white eliminates My Senpai is Annoying. Made by a Japanese person excludes half of Dr. Stone. But as with genres, this is just a little slice of information, and you have to do some thinking to make up the rest you don't have from that one piece. And then linguistically, each of our three pose different issues. Korean, Japanese, and Chinese all use honorifics, but what the exact words are vary between the languages, as do the frequency of use. As English has no real equivalent, they'll often just be romanized and have a small explanation if you're lucky. Because manga is more popular, honorifics like chan, kun, and sensei are more likely to be kept in Japanese, but nim and sunbei may be omitted or a translated equivalent used. And as for zhangsheng and zhaoji, oh well. Treating all three as the same is a massive exercise in willful ignorance, and can make you blind to sudden cultural contexts that directly impede your understanding of the story. This language can easily express a character's attitude or relationship and create situations that could explicitly only exist as a product of that country, like the Watashi Boku Ore scene in Your Name, being almost incomprehensible in the dub. Not that I can think of a better translation that easily, because English just isn't set up for this particular misunderstanding. Instead, you might rely on just the character not knowing where they live as being enough, and play off that. A lot of this video emphasized the history of Japan's imperial expansion, and so you often see traces of this in Korean and Japanese media, and not always for good. If you refuse to distinguish these cultural products, you're also refusing to distinguish their specific issues with racism and xenophobia, such as South Korea and Hitalia, but at least Hitalia is almost equally racist to every country on Earth somehow. Luckily, there aren't too many examples of this, but the trope of the dumb Korean man who can't speak Japanese well, or the Chinese girl in a kipao who can't speak Japanese very well. Of course, stereotypes extend beyond Korea and China, like the albino Russian or the big-boobed American. Some sports manga like Kuroko no Basket also depict non-Japanese players as being unfairly big or having some kind of genetic edge in an almost self-deprecating way. A lot of Western fans of manga will take something like Beastars and only look at it through the lens of Western racism, and so ignore if there's a specific cultural context. The same thing happened with Squid Game, where the specifically Korean struggles of Korean debt culture was appropriated to be about American capitalism. We are eternal hipsters about Squid Game, as we watched it day one before the hype. But it was frustrating watching people take a story we had found to be a fascinating insight into Korean culture and make it essentially about themselves. Relating to the struggles of a character or story is one thing, but a lot of people online tend to mistake that for the creators speaking specifically to them about their issues. It's a complex thing, and one that could be easily its own video, but the gist of the issue is that if you only see yourself in media, you're going to start ignoring all the parts that aren't you to reaffirm that belief. Nothing exemplifies this more than this tweet that blew up on Twitter just as we were finishing this script. It was retweeted by Hideo Kojima and talks about the historical Japanese job of bokeh, which as someone who's watched someone else play Death Stranding immediately made me go, oh, and I wasn't alone in this. A lot of the responses to this express a similar sort of epiphany, but equally a lot of people got annoyed that people thought this was something that should be common knowledge amongst analysts of the game. Because, well, why should you have to know this? What's the point? Well, because this cultural context really, recontextualizes the whole game. I could probably write a lot on this concept about how using traditional jobs in post-apocalypse holds so much meaning of the persistence of humanity and what binds the past to the future. But more importantly, I think there's value in understanding where someone's ideas come from, and this was a piece of information most people who talk about Death Stranding don't have. And that's sad. The way you carry packages is one of the most iconic things about the game. Such a massive game, in fact, that I feel this term should have become mainstream. But there were only 1,000 results for it before this tweet blew up. The information was there, but so few people spoke about it. Things like this always remind me of my least favourite question in interviews. Where do you get your ideas from? As artists, it's just, sigh. Tell me you've never had to reflect on your work before. This very video is an amalgamation of dozens of experiences from just 2 people. Look at how many sources we have here. Each of these was an inspiration for an idea or point we wanted to convey. And this is mostly a factual video. If it was something more opinion-based or creative, it could take us days to explain ourselves. And that's not a skill everyone has. We were literally taught this type of critical thinking as art students. But it does so much to be able to see the links between inspiration and art, in both the positive and negative. Look at the meme that Quentin Tarantino is into feet. That's a deeper understanding of films through knowing where someone's inspiration is from. With this, we know these shots might not be relevant to the narrative, but they help build up an understanding of the film as a piece of art made by people. Are the curtains blue because the author likes the colour blue, or because the main love interest has blue eyes, or maybe the character's mother likes blue, but they'd rather they were red curtains? Even though Death Stranding is set in America, the fact that a core part of its design is so explicitly Japanese is something to keep in your mind, because it can totally change your interpretation of something as simple as a job role. A postman is less likely to have connotations of hard labor, heavy weight, and reaching rural areas, but may still carry themes of community and reliability. But back to Manhwa, Manhwa, and Manga. There is value in distinguishing these three categories, and it isn't a point of pretentiousness to use the terms correctly. There might be an overly correcting people who don't use the terms, but that's because Manhwa and Manhwa really aren't mainstream terms. Yet. While in the bookshop, we saw a hilarious amount of Korean or Chinese series directly under the large word manga. But we frequented this particular shop a lot over the years, and these two entire sections of manga used to just be one shelf of only the most popular manga, but now there's manhwa and light novels. Because they're getting more popular, they get to be stocked too. It's great they're accessible to English fans and don't cost 30 quid to import from America. When I totaled up the numbers on that display, I was surprised how few weren't manga, but there were plenty more not on the table, just on the shelves, so maybe someday the shop will have enough to create a Manhwa and Manhwa section. And the first step to that is understanding why the terms exist separately at all, which hopefully we've started to do in this video. If you want to read deeper, there is a companion document to this video that has all our sources, as well as things I stumbled upon that were interesting but not wholly relevant or would have made this video even longer, like a whole bunch of stuff on the North Korean comics industry, and a recipe for roti. So to conclude this over 40-minute long video, if you won't use the words Manhwa and Manhwa, you probably shouldn't use the word manga and just call them comics.
And on that bombshell, the video is almost over. What do you guys think about Manga, Manhwa, and Manhwa? Do you have a favourite, and if so, why? And while you're commenting your answer, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps us out. We also have a Patreon if you want early access to videos as we work on them, and a bunch of other cool stuff. I'm always the most inspired to create when I know there'll be other people around to watch and engage with it. So I hope you stick around, and we'll see you next time. Bye!